Imagine growing up in a place where every child already knows exactly how and when they will die. There is no "when I get old." There is no retirement, no white hair, no grandparents' stories. None of that exists. There, life is not a long line. It's a countdown. You learn to walk, and you also learn the day you will be taken. You learn to speak, and you learn not to ask questions. You learn to love, knowing that everything will end much sooner than it should. And the scariest part of all? No one found it strange. No one screamed. No one protested. No one ran away. Because in that town, death was not a punishment. It was routine. It was accepted. It was expected. It was even celebrated. People woke up every day, worked, smiled, got married, had children, as if it were normal to live in a place where growing old was forbidden. And the most disturbing thing is that to them, it made sense. If this story is already getting to you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because what you're about to discover now about this town will make you question everything you understand about life, society, and even about humanity. Because when you find out how they decided who died and how it all began, you will realize that the real horror was not in death itself. If you looked at that town from the outside, you wouldn't see chaos. You wouldn't see violence. You wouldn't see despair. You would see order, clean streets, aligned houses, polite people, disciplined children. It was the kind of place many would call a model society. There were clear rules, there were schedules, there were religious rituals, collective celebrations, a constant sense of purpose. No one went hungry, no one lived abandoned, no one seemed to suffer. Everything worked. People worked with dedication, they married young, they raised their children within the same rules, teaching values, respect, obedience, and above all, they taught acceptance. Acceptance that life had a limit, acceptance that everyone had a role, acceptance that no one was above the law. There, individual sacrifice was seen as necessary for collective stability. And this is where the mind starts to get confused, because at first glance it even seems fair. There is society without old age, without prolonged illnesses, without slow suffering. A society where everything is controlled, predictable, organized. But there is a brutal difference between order and absolute control. And behind that appearance of peace, there was a silent rule that everyone knew, but no one dared to question. A rule that defined the true price of that perfection. And when you understand that rule, and everything changes, because you realize that town wasn't organized, it was programmed, and every person was already marked. And what defined that mark will shock you. No one in that town died of old age, not because they lived long, but because they were not allowed to reach it. There was a limit, an invisible limit, but absolutely unbreakable. Some say it was an exact age. Others say it was based on physical strength. Others still that it was decided in a ritual. But everyone knew one thing. When your time came, there was no choice. It didn't matter who you were. It didn't matter how much you had contributed. It didn't matter how many lives you had helped. It didn't matter if you were rich, or a leader, or a hero. No one was spared, because for them equality was taken to the cruelest extreme possible. Everyone was eliminated before they became old. And the most disturbing part? People didn't fight against it. They prepared for it. There were planned goodbyes. There were rehearsed words. There were entire families gathering, not to prevent it, but to watch. Because from a young age, children were taught to see that moment, not as an execution, but as a duty to the town, a duty to order, a duty to the future. And this is where the horror stops being just a rule and becomes a system where living too long was seen as a mistake, and dying early was seen as a virtue. But what really turns this into something disturbing is the way everything happened, because death was not hidden. It was public, it was collective, it was turned into ceremony. And when you see how those executions took place, who watched, and what was said in that moment, you will understand why no child in that town ever dreamed of growing old, because they grew up and watching the end. And that was just the beginning. The day arrived like any other. The sun rose, people left their homes, but everyone knew that this was not an ordinary day. The location was already prepared. Always the same space, always the same setting. A central point in the town, where everyone could see, Because there, death was not hidden. It was displayed. Families gathered. Neighbors arrived in silence. Children were brought by the hand, as if they were going to an important event. And in a way they were. The condemned walked to the center. No chains, no resistance, no screams, because running away was not part of the culture. Questioning was not part of the mindset. There were words, short speeches, phrases that spoke of honor, of duty, of the town's balance, and then the moment arrived. The sound of collective silence, held breaths, fixed stares. And the execution happened. Quick, precise, cold, no spectacle of violence, but with a psychological weight impossible to ignore. Some cried in silence, others kept a steady gaze, trying to show strength. The children watched, absorbing every detail, learning exactly how their own end would be, because their watching was part of the process. Watching normalized, watching taught, watching conditioned. And so generation after generation, death stopped being a shock. It became tradition. It became a calendar. It became culture. And it is at this point that the most uncomfortable question begins to arise. Who turned this into law? Who decided that this ritual should exist? Who chose? Who was next? Because when there is a system, there is always someone in control. And when you discover who controlled life and death in that town, the fear changes shape. It stops being about dying and starts being about who has the power to order killing. Now imagine living knowing exactly that there is a limit to your life. Not a distant, uncertain limit that's like in the real world, but a clear, inevitable, programmed limit that changes everything. It changes the way you love. It changes the way you choose who to be with. It changes the way you raise your children. Because deep down, everyone knew that every moment was temporary. Couples united already aware that one day they would say goodbye, not by choice, but by obligation. Parents looked at their children, knowing they were preparing them not for old age, but for their own end. And children grew up without the concept of a long future, without dreams of growing old, without plans for decades. They learned to live within a deadline. And when you grow up like that, you don't question, you obey, because fear doesn't need to be shouted. It just needs to be remembered. Every execution you watch reinforces the message. Every goodbye reaffirms the rule. Every collective silence teaches that no one should challenge the system. And so the town built something more powerful than any weapon. Absolute obedience, not based only on force, but on psychological conditioning. People followed the rules, not because they agreed, but because they couldn't imagine any other reality. And that is what makes this story so disturbing. Because when fear is internalized, it no longer needs constant surveillance. People control themselves, they police themselves, they surrender themselves. But this raises an even darker question. If everyone obeyed, if no one resisted, who was at the top? Deciding who lived and who died, who benefited from this system, who had the power to keep everything running. Because no structure like this exists by chance. It is built, it is maintained, it is controlled. And when you discover who was responsible for that control, you will realize that the real danger of that town was never the rule. It was whoever created it. Behind every rule, there is someone who sustains it. In that town, death did not happen on its own. It was authorized. It was organized. It was decided. There was a group, a core of power that was not questioned. Some called it a council. Others, spiritual leaders. Others, still, believed it was divine will interpreted by men. But in the end, they were people. People with enough authority to look at another human being and determine the end of their life. They analyzed, they observed, they classified. Who had already fulfilled their role? Who was too weak? Who was starting to question? Who could become a problem? And then the decision was made. Cold, formal, without emotion. There was no defense. There was no public trial. There was no second chance. Because the system was not made to be fair, it was made to be maintained. And little by little, that rule saying everyone had the same fate began to reveal something even darker. It didn't just eliminate old age. It eliminated inconvenience. The sick were taken earlier. Rebels disappeared sooner. Voices that questioned simply never reached the official limit. The execution stopped being merely cultural. It became political. It became control. It became a way to keep the population obedient, silent, predictable. Because when you know you could be next, you don't question. And when no one questions, power grows without limits. But every system based on fear carries an invisible weakness. Because fear, when accumulated long enough, stops generating obedience and starts generating revolt. And that is exactly what began to happen. First in silence, then in whispers, and then in actions. And when the first people decided they would no longer accept that fate, the town that seemed perfect began to crack. At first, they were just small signs, suspicious looks, conversations interrupted when someone approached, families whispering behind closed doors. But fear was no longer silent. It was turning into distrust. People began to realize that anyone could denounce anyone. All it took was a suspicion, a word out of place, a question considered wrong. And suddenly, you could be called before your time. Friends began to distrust friends. Neighbors started watching each other. Even within family, silence became heavy, because no one knew who to trust. Some tried to flee, but fleeing meant abandoning everything: family, history, identity. And many were captured and used as examples. Executions began to happen more frequently, faster, less ceremonial. The ritual lost the little honor it still seemed to have. Now, it was just elimination. And the tighter the system squeezed, the more unbearable the town became to live in. Children no longer looked to the future with acceptance, but with dread. Adults began to quietly question whether it really made sense. Trust disappeared. And when a society loses trust, it begins to collapse from the inside out. That town that seemed organized was now a place where no one felt safe, no one felt free, no one felt alive. And when living starts to seem worse than dying, collapse stops being a possibility. It becomes inevitable. And what happened next was not just the end of a system, it was the end of an entire town. No system based on fear lasts forever. It can last years, it can last generations, but there comes a moment when it begins to destroy itself from within. In that town, that moment arrived. Some say it started with a revolt, others say it was a series of escapes, others that the population simply stopped obeying. But the fact is that one way or another, control broke. Executions began to be questioned. Orders stopped being followed. Those responsible lost the dominance they seemed to have forever, and when fear stops working, the entire system collapses. Without obedience, there was no more ritual. Without ritual, there was no more rule. Without rule, there was no more town. Some people left, others stayed, trying to rebuild something that was already too corrupted to be saved. Over time, the streets became empty. The houses were abandoned. The spaces where ceremonies once took place became just silent places. No applause, no speeches, no crowds, just echoes. What remained were ruins, fragmented records, stories that were passed down from generation to generation, not as an example, but as a warning. Because that town did not go down in history as a model of organization. It went down as a reminder of what happens when a society gradually accepts what should never be normalized. And that is exactly why this story did not stay in the past. It remains relevant, because in different ways the same pattern still exists, and perhaps it is closer to us than it seems. Now answer me honestly. If you had been born in that town, would you have accepted that rule? Would you have looked at it as justice or as cruelty? Would you have taught your child to accept their own end, or would you have tried to flee with them? Because for them it made sense. It was seen as order, as balance, as a way to keep society functioning. But for you, is this justifiable? Is there any situation in which taking someone's life before old age can be considered right? Or will it always be wrong, regardless of culture and time? And if you were there, watching those executions, would you have had the courage to question? Or would you have stayed silent, afraid of being next? Now look at the present. Are we really that far from that town? Today, when someone makes a mistake, what happens? Are they corrected, or are they publicly destroyed? How many times have you seen virtual crowds deciding who deserves to continue existing socially and who should be erased? How many times has a reputation been executed in the public square? Without defense and without context, without a second chance? Are we not creating modern versions of that same ritual? Not with blades, but with words, with judgments, with cancellations. Who decides today who deserves to be heard and who should be silenced? Who defines who still has value and who should be discarded? And more importantly, have you ever stopped to think which side you are on when this happens? Do you watch in silence? Do you participate? Do you question? Because every society that begins to accept small symbolic eliminations, over time, can begin to accept real eliminations. And the most uncomfortable question of all is, if you lived in that town, would you have had the courage to go against it? Or would you have learned to accept like everyone else? Comment below what you would do. If this video made you reflect, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone you think would like to hear this story. Because in the end, every society that decides who deserves to live one day starts killing before old age.